What happens when someone experiences a genuine psychiatric crisis, recovers from it, but the crisis continues to influence how authorities see that person years later? That is basically the question behind my case. For me, it is not about saying psychiatry should never exist. It is about what happens afterward, when old diagnoses, old records, and old assumptions continue affecting your life. Before we talk about the institutions, let's start with what actually happened to you. Before the disputes began, what was happening in your life? The wider story involved physical health problems, chronic pain, and high family expectations about my education. I was navigating these pressures before the psychiatric crises ever began. Was there ever a time when you yourself believed psychiatric intervention was justified? Yes, there were genuine periods when I was psychologically unwell. I accept that intervention can sometimes be necessary. If you accept that intervention can be necessary, where does your disagreement actually begin? The failure occurs after the crisis ends. That's when a temporary intervention morphs into a permanent loss of adult autonomy. You've called this a chain reaction. How did a past hospitalization file become the singular lens through which the authorities judged your later behavior? What I found is that once a previous hospitalization exists in the record, later events are automatically interpreted through that history. Why are these medical records so important to the process? They establish a tangible bureaucratic reality. A psychiatric report affects future doctors, insurance decisions, and even police interpretation. So later restrictions were justified primarily by citing the original record, rather than assessing new evidence. Exactly. In all 6 cases I experienced, the reasoning relied on the fact that a record already existed from 2017. They weren't looking at who I was in the moment. They were looking at the file. How did you notice that people were treating you differently? You transitioned from being a patient to being a suspect in your own care. My perspective was treated as a symptom rather than an account of facts. Unchecked documentation creates an inescapable loop where the official, historical record permanently overrides a patient's current reality. Your family appears repeatedly in this story. Do you think they believed they were protecting you? I think they were frightened, but they refused to discuss their concerns with me directly, which is where the problem starts. How did those unilateral decisions affect your autonomy? When decisions are made behind your back, you lose your standing as an adult. You are no longer part of the conversation about your own life. How was the disability assessment process used to challenge your capability to make basic life decisions?
My family used psychiatric diagnoses as a legal tool. They attempted to have someone else appointed to make decisions on my behalf, effectively using my medical history to limit my freedom. Is it difficult to navigate a system where a relative's subjective fear holds more legal weight than your own testimony? It is nearly impossible. The system is designed to respond to the fear of the family rather than the rights of the individual. What should a fair, collaborative process have looked like instead? It would have required transparency. If there were concerns, they should have been reviewable and open to reassessment, with my own perspective included in the record. When relatives use outdated psychiatric labels to make unilateral legal decisions, protection morphs into control. Beyond the family, there were police interactions.
Which parts of that can you support with records? I have the protocols from police questioning and searches. I ended up on a list because of my history, which led to authorities searching my flat and my parents' cellar for weapons. Can we separate what you know from your interpretation of why the authorities acted? The searches and the legal hurdles are documented facts. My interpretation is that my psychiatric history flagged me as a threat, but I don't yet know exactly why they chose to act at that specific moment. What if the officers and doctors involved genuinely believed they were doing the right thing? Good intentions don't change the fact that procedures were not followed. Intention is not enough when it leads to a loss of rights. A bureaucracy doesn't require malicious actors to cause serious harm. Good intentions paired with unchecked power still create situations where an individual's rights are set aside. Were there also psychiatrists or psychologists you trusted? Yes. There were professionals who worked collaboratively with me. They treated me as an adult and recognized that my problems weren't purely psychiatric. Your story eventually connects to a much bigger subject, critical thinking. Why? Because my case is about the danger of trusting institutions without evaluation. People often trust experts or politicians without examining the evidence they're being told. Why do you look at institutions like the church when discussing independent thought? These institutions often discourage independent thinking once they become part of a dominant system. They demand a type of blind compliance that mirrors what I saw in the medical system. You've mentioned that hiding the truth is a civilizational danger. Exactly. If we stop questioning accepted narratives, we lose the ability to distinguish what is known from what is merely suspected. You also see this in politics, the silencing of those who challenge the narrative. When institutions have this much power and no oversight, silencing opposition becomes the default reaction. But how do you distinguish critical thinking from simply adopting new conspiracies? By using evidence and testing assumptions. It's about the willingness to change your mind when a prediction you make turns out to be wrong. A citizen's intellectual autonomy depends on their willingness to scrutinize institutional narratives with the same rigor they would apply to their own medical history. You often use the word oversight. What would proper oversight actually look like? It means independent review, access to your own records, and accountability when procedures fail. Decisions that restrict freedom must be documented and reviewable. Is your goal punishment or institutional learning? It's about preventing similar problems for others. I want a system that is transparent enough to admit and correct its own mistakes. What should a viewer who has never experienced this take away? That institutions make mistakes. A temporary crisis should not result in a permanent loss of credibility or a clear path back to full autonomy and freedom. A trustworthy institution is defined not by a lack of errors, but by its transparent mechanisms for correcting them and restoring a person's rights.